So my name is Sean McGeever, and I'm a Young Life leader at Pinnacle High School here in Phoenix, Arizona, and I also work for Young Life. I've been going through different chapters in the Gospel of John about how to do club talks or some tips and ideas about doing club talks through the Gospel of John. And today we are at John 11. So this virtually the most of the chapter is taken up with an amazing story, which is where Jesus resurrects Lazarus. And so we're going to go through that. It's a classic Young Life story. It's an easy one to do a Young Life talk on. There are so many things that you could cover in here. The hard part would probably be not trying to do too much, but to pick a main point or two. So here's the gist of the story, which is in the beginning, Jesus finds out, people come and tell him that Lazarus is sick. And Jesus quickly points out that he's not actually sick, but he knows that Lazarus is dead. So the next thing that we have, I have the outline in 4 points. So that's the first part. Jesus finds out that Lazarus is sick, but actually knows that he's dead. Second part is that we learn a lot about who Jesus is, that his divine and human nature. We find out a bunch of things, which I'll cover in a moment. The third part of the story is that we hear about Lazarus raising from the dead, Lazarus coming out from the tomb. So there's a resurrection. So that's the third part. And then the fourth part is the response of people. And in fact, if you look at some kind of translations, it might have it as a different section. The section might end at verse 44, but I think that going on to verse 45 is really helpful because it talks about the people around the Jewish people's response. So anyway, first part, learn about Lazarus' death. Second part, about Jesus' nature, his divine and human nature. Third part, that Jesus is able to resurrect Lazarus. And fourth is the response. I mean, that's a perfect outline for a talk. A couple main points that you could go with. One is that Jesus shows us that death is not the end of the story for those who put their faith in him. So though many people fear death, and rightly so, it's pretty scary, that is not the end of the story for those who put their faith in Jesus. The second is that a main point, that Jesus shows both his divinity and his humanity, which is to say that Jesus is both God and he's human. He is certainly human, just like you and me, but he is God, like only God could be. And we see that in a lot of ways in the story. I think I'll show at least 4 in a moment here. And the last one would be that Jesus is life. And I'll make a big point about kind of the way it's said here, but Jesus is life, and that Jesus is death to life now. I'm saying that in a pretty specific way, which I'll make clear later. But there's a couple main points. There's a lot in the section about what does it say about Jesus, and I'm going to go through a couple ones. The first one might be a little bit surprising. It might not be one that you get all excited about. Might not make the crowd feel all warm and fuzzy, but I think it's worth saying, which is Jesus doesn't always do what we want him to do. He didn't leave right away to go help Lazarus. As we know from the story in verse 6, he waited 2 days. So what does this show us about Jesus? What does this show us about God? God doesn't always do what we think he should do. And we find out later with this, it was kind of part of the plan. And we see in other scriptures, like for instance, the man that was born blind, this happened so that the power of God might be displayed in his life. But in the moment, God doesn't always do what we want him to do. So that's one point that we just learned. It's just a fact, and it actually matches up with the reality of what a lot of us go through. I have a friend right now that I wish was healed, and that's not happening at the moment. So that's the reality of it. The story has that in it too. The second part is that Jesus is a prophet. So he knows things that no human would know. For instance, he knew that Lazarus was dead. So Jesus knows all. He's omniscient is the technical word for it. He knows details that we can't know. And he also knows not only that Lazarus is dead, but that he was going to rise from the dead again. So in verse 23, he mentions that. Another thing that we learn, the third thing that we learn about Jesus, is that Jesus is the resurrection and the life. That's a classic old Young Life song. Jesus is the resurrection and the life. I won't sing the rest of it, but some of you know that song. But here's the thing I want to point out about this. Jesus doesn't say he is about life. Jesus doesn't say he's about resurrection. Jesus doesn't say I am about a future resurrection. I'll be around later. Jesus says, I am life, which I think we won't be able to even get the full impact of that here when me talking about it, not in a club talk, but this is what I'd like to say. Jesus just isn't about life. Jesus is life. It'd be difficult to make this point strong enough in the club talk, but do your best. One way to think about it is that Jesus is not a path or a gateway or a plan to life. Knowing and believing in Jesus is life. When you believe right now in Jesus, you are believing in life and experiencing life right now. The way to experience life is to believe in Jesus. Now, it's not like if I believe in Jesus one day, I'll have this good life. No, the moment that you believe in Jesus, and in every moment that you believe and put your faith in Jesus, you are experiencing life. Similarly, Jesus is resurrection. He is the resurrection. He's not the future resurrection. He is about, like I said in the beginning, Jesus is about death to life now. So, Jesus isn't a pathway or a gateway or a plan for future resurrection. Jesus is resurrection right now in your life. When you believe about Jesus right now, he is resurrecting and turning things that are dead in us into life right now. So that's a bit of a tricky one, but that's the way that Jesus talks about himself, and any way that we can make that point and bring the reality of it to people who are listening right now is a good one. Another part, the fourth part, would be that Jesus is at the same time God and he's also human. So Jesus was deeply moved in spirit and ultimately wept. You see that in verse 34 and 35. And I don't know if I would mention this in a club talk, but maybe in campaigners. Jesus was prophesied as the one who would carry our sorrows. That we hear that in Isaiah 53 verse 4. Jesus is called the man of sorrows, in fact, in Isaiah 53:3. And in this passage, he's actually bearing and carrying pain to the point of tears. So to put it another way, one thing that we learn about Jesus is that God bears grief and pain to the point of human tears in the person of Jesus. The man that everyone was expecting that was going to be a man of sorrow and a man that was going to carry our sorrow right in front of their eyes was one who was crying and weeping and mourning with them. And the last one, the fifth point about Jesus, is that Jesus has the power to bring the dead to life. So we see that at the end in verse 43 and 44. What does this have to do with our life? Our timing is not God's timing. I kind of made that point before, but that is a challenging and difficult one. But there it is in Scripture, and we connects with reality. Then, just like those in the story, we find out that Jesus loves us. You see that in verse 5. He says that he loves Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He loves all of us. Jesus challenges us. He asks them in verse 26, do you believe this? So he challenges us and asks us, do we believe this? We can put that right back on the students, in fact, ourselves, in our club talk. Do you believe this? Also, Jesus weeps and mourns with us. So when we weep and mourn, the Spirit of God, the living God, is certainly understands what that's like and is available to be with us in our mourning. And Jesus has the power to resurrect lives. A couple technical details. One, some of these are pretty minor but interesting. One is the word Bethany, when it says that, let's see here, that he was from Bethany, the man Lazarus. The word Bethany, the town that he's from, actually means house of the poor. And some scholars think that Bethany was a place where poor people lived, and actually it would be almost where people would go when they were sick, almost like a hospice area. So, the context of this is people who are poor, who are sick, maybe marginalized and hurting. This is the sort of place where Lazarus was from. That might be relevant or interesting to pass along. Another one talks about Judea. You might not be familiar. It might be good to go look it up on a map, but here's what you need to know about Judea. Is that Jesus had been northeast of Judea in an area named Perea, probably right before that. And basically heading toward Judea would have meant heading toward where people were going to kill and stone him. We learned that from verse 8. But just imagine going to a really dangerous area. He was in a safe area, and he knew that he was going to go to a dangerous area, which is where Judea is, which in the region of Judea is Jerusalem and Bethany. In verse 8, they call Jesus a rabbi, which means that he is a respected Jewish teacher. There is an interesting phrase in there in verse 16 where it says that we may die with him. So Thomas says, we'll go with him so that we may die with him. Thomas expected to die, and he went with him. This is the doubting Thomas that we hear about later. He was expecting to die. So there's a lot of faith in him at that point. Another one is the resurrection. It talks about resurrection in verse 24. And the resurrection at this point in Jewish belief, it was a common Jewish belief. We know that the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. It doesn't really talk about him here. The classic line is, they don't believe in the resurrection. That is why we know that they are sad, you see. Anyway, but it was a belief of the future new heavens and new earth, a people and a place of new creation. And last, the word belief and faith are thrown around depending on your translation here in verses 26, 27, and 45. And perhaps that that's actually the same word in Greek in here. So belief and faith are the same word, pistis in Greek. I like the word trust also as another alternative translation, but faith, belief, trust, those are mentioned a bunch of times in here. I'm going to just wrap it up with a couple possible illustrations, but I think you could get I like visuals, so I think you could get a big clock and perhaps like one like a school, it's pretty big, like Flavor Flav would wear around his neck. And to illustrate how painful it is to have to wait for something. So maybe you've had a clock like this in school and you're watching it go and it's just like, when is this going to end? I think you could put that up in front and talk about how difficult it must have been when Jesus was waiting 2 whole days to do what he was going to do. That must have been really frustrating, and how it's difficult to have patience with God in the midst of trying and challenging situations. But that God had a plan, just we don't know his time frame. Another one, I think it's really powerful to talk about how Jesus wept and Jesus mourned. I think that might be difficult to illustrate, but one idea I have would be to get a box of, I have one right here, box of Kleenex, get a box of tissue. Maybe you just have it up there and leave it there. And they'll just maybe you just put it down and people will be curious what that is. And you just say, sometimes you need some tissues because you're going to cry. Jesus wept over his friend weeping, and that he saw that people were really mourning. It just might draw attention to sadness. Just having a visual like that might help. Another one would be not really a visual, but I think any sort of personal testimony where you've experienced mourning, whenever you've cried. It'd be good to ask yourself, when is the last time I cried? And maybe to just kind of, emotionally have a touch point for yourself in this talk and maybe share about that. And maybe perhaps talk about how God has done a resurrection in your life. It turned something that was without hope and maybe rather dead, and that he changed that in your life. The last one, this might be kind of intense. I'll just throw it out there. I like to have too many ideas, make it your own. But at the beginning of the talk, you could have someone, maybe another leader, and you could say, what actually happened is, Lazarus died. And just say, I'm going to have this person up here because I'm going to just have them lay down right next to me as I'm talking here. Because the reality is this was a really difficult situation. I mean, that's pretty intense. But here's the powerful part is if you do your club talk and they're just kind of laying there, when you get to the end, any way that you can dramatize or bring to life, when Jesus says, Lazarus, come out, if that person has been sitting there, maybe laying there, listening to your talk, for 10 minutes up in front and everyone can see them, and you say, Lazarus, come out, and that person slowly gets up, and you go, this is what God does. He takes people, definitely physically who died, but also kind of spiritually who have died, and what he can do in our lives is he can make the dead come to life. And Jesus says, Lazarus, come out, and he does. So anyway, that might be a little bit of a stretch, but there's a couple ideas there. Hopefully this would be a good club talk to do. It definitely illustrates the human side of Jesus in a great way. A lot of the other stories in John thus far emphasize his divinity and a few other things. This is a great one, especially with the weeping, the crying, the difficulty when somebody's sick or even dying or dead, about what that's like. So I'll leave it at that. Well, I'm going to wrap it up, but hey, blessings on Club Talk, and have a great week. Talk to you later. Bye.